The dire and deplorable conditions inside Egypt's prisons. Human rights organizations blame torture, sweltering conditions and lack of medical help for a growing number of prisoner deaths. What's being done to monitor jail conditions, and can the Egyptian government be pressured to make improvements? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly Thibault. Human Rights Watch says prisons and police stations across Egypt are bursting at the seams. Dozens of Egyptians have died in government custody, many packed into tiny cells, and as the summer heat increases, there are fears more will suffer the same fate. Opposition supporters continue to be rounded up by security forces, together with journalists who speak out against the Egyptian government and its policies. Allegations of torture and disappearances have increased since the army removed former President Mohamed Morsi almost 3 years ago and Abdel Fattah al-Sisi took over. While Egypt's Deputy Interior Minister recently responded to claims that the prison system is at breaking point, saying the ministry's detailed report about the so-called phenomenon of forced disappearances in Egypt will be thoroughly reviewed by Parliament's Human Rights Committee. Well, human rights groups say the Egyptian government hasn't taken serious steps either to improve detention conditions or to independently investigate the deaths of detainees. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch say many detainees appear to have died after being physically abused or tortured. Tora prison south of Cairo is one of the oldest prisons in Egypt. Cells are locked 20 hours a day, leaving inmates little time to exercise and see natural light. Tora was also where Al Jazeera journalists Peter Greste, Bahay Mohammed and Mohammed Fahmy were imprisoned. They were freed after an international outcry. Al-Aqra prison is more modern, but there are claims inmates are repeatedly tortured and abused by prison guards. Similarly, rights groups are concerned about systematic abuse in Al-Qanater women's prison, where sexual and physical abuse is reported. Let's now bring in our guests for today's discussion. In London, Nicholas Piachaud, Egypt's researcher at Amnesty International. In Washington, D.C., Mohamed Soltan, a human rights advocate and former political prisoner. Mohamed was on hunger strike for over 16 months. And also in London, Maha Azzam, head of the Egyptian Revolutionary Council. Welcome all. Thank you for being on Inside Story. Mohamed Soltan, in Washington, you spent over 600 days behind bars. What is it like being a prisoner in Egypt? Tell us about the conditions you endured while behind bars.
Well, I mean, let me start off by saying that it's easily the worst experience of my life. And the psychological torture, when people ask me about the torture that happens, the physical torture, yes, you get beaten. There are welcoming parties where you have to run in between, you're handcuffed to somebody, you have to run between two guards, and you're getting beaten, you're stripped to your underwear and you're beaten. For example, I had a broken arm from a gunshot wound that I had gotten at the Rabaa dispersal, and I was beaten on my broken arm for 2 straight hours. I'm not going to talk about the interrogations where you're blindfolded and you're facing the wall and you're getting beaten into, you know, asking when you're getting interrogated for things you didn't do and getting, and all of that, honestly, or having an impromptu surgery in an underground dungeon, overcrowded underground dungeon where an inmate doctor had to perform an impromptu surgery with a straight razor and pliers. All of that doesn't compare because the physical pain goes away, but the psychological torture, the systematic psychological torture, where you're placed in a place where solitary confinement is an upgrade, where where you don't hear anything. You can't hear, you're not allowed to be in contact with a living soul, where everything is stripped away from you, anything materialistic. There's a windowless room where you don't have a sense of time, you don't have, and you know, razors that are being, you know, slipped under the door, and doctors encouraging you how to commit suicide.
Okay.
Electric wires being exposed and telling you how to hold them. All of those things, you know, I was in there for 6 months in that in that kind of condition, utter isolation.
Right.
That the psychological stuff, it stays with you. So
let me just ask you this. I understand you were transferred from different prisons over your time in detention. You were arrested in August of 2013 after the Rabat sit-in, and you were transferred to several prisons. Is it different from prison to prison? Are there certain facilities that are better than others?
Well, certainly there are, but not the ones that we were transferred to as political prisoners. There is the Mazra'a prison, for example, that was reserved for the VIP. That's where Mubarak and his kids and all of the Mubarak's ex-regime stayed. That's the VIP where, you know, this is where the cameras, the state cameras all go and they're recording how prisons are like. But where we were at, we were literally in underground dungeons. And it's, again, you know, in the beginning, some of these different prisons had just a small window at the top of the cell where we literally would wait like hours, so just we can get just like just a ray of sunlight, and it's terrible. It's a living man's graveyard. Honestly, that's the only way you can describe it. And yeah.
Thank you for sharing that experience with us. I want to bring in Nicolas Piachaud now from Amnesty International. Nicolas, what is Amnesty International's main concern today, main complaint about the state of Egypt's prisons?
I mean, prisons in Egypt are a living hell. I mean, they're squalid, overcrowded, and dangerous. And we're concerned that things are only getting worse. Families of detainees, of prisoners, human rights lawyers have told us that their prison visits are being severely limited, that they're unable to bring the food, medicine, and clothes that prisoners so badly require. We have reports of people being packed in like animals into prison cells, which are freezing cold at night and in the winter, and boiling hot in the summer months in which we're coming into now. We have an epidemic of deaths in custody, particularly at police stations, which are going uninvestigated. And I think above all of this, there is this tremendous sense of hopelessness. And while Mohamed was speaking, I was also thinking of a photojournalist who's been detained in Egypt now since August 2013, Mahmoud Abu Zaid, and he's spoken of being sort of feeling like he's lost in a black hole. And I think that's something that really sums up what we're seeing in the prison system today, that people go in and they don't go out. And a lot of time when they go in, it's for peacefully exercising their human rights.
Maha Azzam, Egypt's jails were one of the most feared parts of the former President Hosni Mubarak's security apparatus. Would you say that they're worse now than under the previous government?
I think from what we're hearing from human rights organizations and from people like Mohamed Soltan and from the families of those in prison, the situation is far more dire. We are seeing a systematic process of creating conditions that are harmful to the prisoners, so harmful that many die in prison. The conditions are such that there is very little ventilation in these prisons, and as we've heard, with the coming heat of the summer, I presume more people are going to die in Egypt's prisons. This is part and parcel of a political system. We cannot separate what is happening in Egypt's prisons from the type of political system that exists today in Egypt.
Right.
A dictatorship that has no limits in terms of its abuse of power.
Okay. I just want to ask you about the conditions in the prisons a bit more, because Mohamed mentioned that it was different whether you're in a political prisoner facility, or it differs basically from facility to facility. I wonder about the treatment female prisoners are subjected to. Is it different? Is it worse than the conditions that male prisoners face?
I think there is a clear political direction on the part of the regime, of the security forces and those who run the prisons to break the will of any political inmate. to ensure that there is no political opposition or resistance to the regime. And therefore, the treatment of all prisoners in Egypt is inhuman, but those of political prisoners is particularly so. The idea is to break the will of the political resistance to the regime, which so far has not been broken from what we've seen of those who've come to the courtrooms after being imprisoned, even without charges. Their spirits are high. The leadership of the political forces are saying we are not going to succumb, and they're saying to those outside, carry on. But clearly, yes, the regime has a systematic intention to torture, to break the will of those that want to resist.
Mohamed Soltan in Washington, tell us more about the people who make up this prison population in Egypt today. When you were in jail, who did you share your cell with? Who were the people that were behind bars, and what were they there for?
So from the get-go, there was a variety and a wide spectrum of people from all political, ideological backgrounds. You had in the last prison I was in, which was the maximum security prison, I was in a ward, and this ward it's called Tagruba ward, and it's in Liman Tora prison, one of 7 or 8 prisons in the Tora complex. And there, Ahmed Maher, the head of the 6th of April movement, Ala Abd Fattah, one of the January 25th revolution's icons and blogger. You had Ahmed Doma, you had Muhammad Adil. You also had the son of Dr. Biltagi, Anas al-Biltagi. You had the son of Dr. Muhammad Morsi. You had people from all across the political ideological spectrum. You also had the ISIS and Al-Qaeda guys that were in there, all in this very weird mix, where it was very interesting to see the kind of interactions that happened there. But that's there for another topic. But I just want to touch back on that the people that are inside of prisons are all belong to the January 25th revolution camp.
Right.
Anyone who has any voice of dissent, they're put in there. There is, and recently the crackdown has reached even human rights lawyers, NGOs, and human rights defenders. So so that's something to touch on. But also, what I endured, and all happened under the supervision of the U.S. Embassy in Cairo, the U.S. Embassy, local human rights organizations that were still functioning at the time had some sort of supervision or oversight on these prisons. Today, with the most recent wave of crackdown, there isn't even that. So imagine, the general and his government have a green card,
right,
to just a green light to just do as they wish,
and I do want to ask Nicholas about that.
Oversight or anything.
I do want to ask Nicholas about that. Nicholas, is there any oversight? I mean, there are no official statistics on the number of inmates in Egyptian prisons, no statistics on the numbers who have died in prison. The government says that these stories of torture that we keep hearing about are fabricated, are not the truth, and that that it's going to be investigating all these accounts. Is that happening at all? Is there oversight?
No, absolutely not. I mean, I think that there's a series of systemic problems. We have prosecutors who are not doing their jobs in investigating prisons. We have prosecutors who are ignoring routine complaints of torture and other ill treatment. And we also, of course, have members of the National Council for Human Rights who seem to be sort of whitewashing some of the gross human rights violations we're seeing, at prisons like, for example, Tora Prison. And I think we have, a government which is unwilling to acknowledge the scale of the human rights crisis. I mean, this is a crackdown which has put, by the Interior Minister's own sort of admission, tens of thousands of people behind bars. I mean, it's filled prisons and police stations far beyond the operational capacity. And we have cells which were built to hold hardened criminals, now holding peaceful protesters and political prisoners, and yes, journalists. I mean, to touch back on the earlier point.
But it is interesting to point out that the government has said that the number of prisons has increased. I mean, it's building more facilities to, I guess, accommodate all these people that they're arresting.
Right, but the answer to this crisis is not to build more prisons, it's to end the crackdown. I mean, you can't build a prison big enough to hold the whole of Egypt. And I think if you crack open one of these prison cells, if you're a fly on the wall, you will see people from all segments of Egypt. They're not just terrorists like the government wants to make out. You have liberal activists, you have members and supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood, you have journalists, and yes, over the last few weeks, you're beginning to see human rights defenders put behind bars as well. You can't build a prison big enough to hold all of that. The only solution is to tolerate peaceful dissent.
Right. Maha Azzam in London, Egypt's National Council for Human Rights, which Nicholas just talked about, is tasked, among other things, with monitoring the country's prisons. Do you think it's able to force the government to address these issues that we've mentioned? Is there any body at all that could force the government to look at this issue of overcrowding and the torture and so on in the prisons?
I think there's got to be international pressure. What we're seeing in terms of some of the human rights organizations in Egypt, the ones that are independent, there's been a clampdown against them. And what survives is one that falls short of in any independence. And that is why the international community and the work done by international organizations such as Amnesty and others is so important. There has to be pressure on governments to really question what is happening in Egypt and to review their policies in terms of their support for a regime that systematically kills and tortures people. What we're seeing in Egypt is not something that has happened overnight. The Egyptian system under Mubarak and today under Sisi is one that does not tolerate opposition. But what we're seeing today is an escalation, one that really is tearing the Egyptian state and society apart.
Right.
Sisi has created a situation that is very dangerous in terms of security and the political fabric of society.
You talk about the need for more international pressure, but in a recent meeting with a U.S. delegation, President Sisi was quoted as saying that human rights and freedoms in Egypt should not be viewed from a Western perspective, which is of a concern, I guess, to many human rights organizations. So can there be international pressure, really? Is there anything that the international community can say or do to make the Egyptian government improve the situation?
The issue of life and death is universal. The right of people not to be tortured is universal.
Okay.
No one in Egypt, in terms of any citizen in Egypt, cannot be denied that right on the basis of culture or the situation in terms of the political transition of Egypt. And of course, the United States and the United Kingdom and the democratic world has fallen far short of where it should be. It is supporting this regime through arms and aid, and therefore it will be seen by the Egyptian people as complicit in what is happening to them. And that is a grave danger, because if the United States and the West doesn't want to be seen as the enemy of the Egyptian people, then it better start pressuring General Sisi in terms of the human rights violations.
Let's hear from Mohamed Soltan in Washington. Mohamed, how can the Egyptian government be pressured to make improvements in the prison system? Because this is what we're talking about in this particular discussion. Obviously, there are improvements that need to be made elsewhere in other domains, but specifically on the prison system in Egypt, how can there be more pressure on the government?
So I want to second Dr. Maha's point about the international community truly mobilizing. And I'm here today. I'm living proof that international pressure works. I was released almost a year, last year, because the United States government and other governments and the international community mobilized and demanded that I be released. And so it happened. It works. Pressure works. What we're seeing now is governments turning a blind eye to systematic, just unprecedented crackdown and these again, like the crackdown, as was mentioned earlier, you can't isolate just the prison situation from the entire crackdown that's happening, because when you're cracking down on local NGOs that had oversight over these prisons and you're kicking out international organizations like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, then again, that's a green light to do as they wish. And there's the GOA has released on May 12th a report the Governmental Accountability Office, that the United States, the State Department in specific, and the Department of Defense are in direct are not complying with their own policies, with their own human rights vetting policies. And, you know, to give all of this aid, it's kind of like a wink, wink, nudge, nudge kind of to the Egyptian government, that do as you wish, and, you know, there's no accountability. So, of course, there's going to be escalating, unprecedented crackdown if there's no accountability. So the government of Egypt needs to be held accountable. And just lastly, there are 4 or 5 other American citizens that are still in these prisons. There is one Irish that is still in these prisons. So there are these governments, the governments of the United States of America, the Irish government, haven't done what they were supposed to be doing and living up to their responsibilities of protecting their own citizens. That's not discounting the thousands of Egyptians that are still in there, but just to kind of give you how the international community hasn't really lived up to its role of standing up for the human rights in Egypt. So, yeah.
All right, Nicholas Piachaud in London. Just coming back to the dire and the deplorable conditions in these Egyptian prisons. As Mohamed said, this is just a symptom of a bigger problem that exists in Egypt today. What do you see the role of the international community being in this issue? And we keep talking about, of course, the many journalists and activists who are behind bars, but there are thousands and thousands of Egyptians as well who are in prison today and are still not being charged. What can be done to help those people?
Well, I mean, I think you have tens of thousands of people who have been arrested as part of this sweeping crackdown on dissent. You have many people who have languished without trial in detention. I think that the number is something like over 1,000, according to the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights. You've also had grossly unfair trials. I mean, I think the international community has failed to recognize the scope of the crisis, and also, I guess, the threat it presents to Egypt's own stability and security. And that's what, I guess, states in the European Union, what the USA says is their priority going forward, is ensuring Egypt remains stable and secure. And I think what diplomats, you know, in New York, in Brussels, in Geneva, and across Europe need to wake up to the fact is that you can't have stability and security when you have, you know, tens of thousands of political prisoners, hundreds of protesters killed, you know, and now hundreds of people enforcibly disappeared. Ultimately, I think diplomats need to have the courage to take on the Egyptian authorities. Egypt is very good at throwing its toys out of the pram, at walking away from meetings. Ultimately, I think the international community needs to be prepared to take them on and play them at their own game and hold them to account for the gross human rights violations we've seen over the last few years.
The most immediate concern now, of course, Nicholas, is the coming months and, you know, these overcrowded prisons. Summer is here, and the fear is that more inmates are going to die because of the overcrowded prisons. What can be done to save lives? I mean, it's maybe seems like a, you know, not important question in the bigger scheme of things, but immediately now what needs to happen is for these people to stop dying in these prisons. What can be done to ensure that?
I mean, I think you need a cohesive strategy from states, you know, in the European Union and in the US. You need to send that very strong political message that people need to stop dying, that they need to eradicate torture and other ill treatment, that fundamentally detainees need to have access to the things that are going to stop them from dying, to adequate medical treatment, to access to their lawyers, to their families. If you have elderly political prisoners in Egypt, they need to have particularly special care. You need to eradicate the diseases that are running rampant in prisons. The problem is, at the moment, the international community is nowhere near that. They're still intent on selling, sealing lucrative arms deals with the Egyptian authorities. And until that stops, there seems to be very little hope that these abuses that are running rampant in prisons are going to stop.
Thank you very much for a very interesting and informative discussion. Mohamed Soltan, Nicholas Piachaud, and Maha Azzam, thank you all for being on this edition of Inside Story. And thank you as well for watching. You can always watch the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter, of course. Our Twitter handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly, Thibault, and the whole team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.